In this clip, we'll take a brief look at what linear workflow is about and how it works with V-Ray for Maya. Now, Maya 2016 and later versions already have proper color management enabled by default. And if you already have an understanding of linear workflow, you can easily skip this clip and move on, and it won't really hurt my feelings. But if you want a quick primer on what this means, or you have to deal with Maya scenes from before version 2016, or you have to set it up manually, go ahead and stick with me through this clip. Now, I'm not going to get all science crazy on you about this. I'm going to speak strictly in loose terms to get the concept across. But really simply, this all has to do with displays and how they interpret their input for you to see what is being displayed properly. Now, you would expect the image that you input to display on your screen with fidelity, meaning the intensity going in is displayed the same way through the screen, giving you a linear graph of input to output, the output being your intensity of brightness. Due to some serious crazy science magic, your display tends to curve this response so that the image looks darker and more crushed when it's viewed in the wrong color space, like this image is here. So your typical image, JPEGs, PNGs, TIFF, and so on, already have that color correction built in so that the image displays properly on your screen, and this is typically called sRGB for these types of image files. EXR and HDR are an exception to this because they are already in linear space and they don't get that sRGB correction. But two things you need to happen for your image to look the way you expect it. First of all, the output, or your render, must be displayed with an sRGB correction, otherwise it looks wrong. Secondly, if you're using file textures of any kind except for EXR and HDR files, which are already linear, you're inputting sRGB texture into this linear workflow, which is going to throw a few things off. You first need to convert those file textures to linear space to work properly. Now, this setting is found in Settings Preferences, Preferences under Color Management. Now, if you're inheriting an older file or picking up an older project, make sure that this option is enabled and everything should be fine with your textures. Now, as far as the other side, when you're viewing your renders, the VFB by default puts you in the proper viewing space when you're viewing your render with this icon here, which is on by default. Now I'll go back into Preferences and I'll turn off Color Management and render the frame, and it all looks washed out since the textures are not in proper color space anymore. You can see the difference between the properly corrected textures and those without pretty clearly. Now, if for some crazy reason you really need to have color management turned off in Maya, you can manually treat the incoming texture files easily through their respective file in nodes. Here I'll select a leaf and bring up its material. The image for its color is this node here. Now, I can't do this through the property editor in the Hypershade. I have to go to the actual attribute editor for this, so I can access the menu Attributes, V-Ray, and then enable Texture Input Gamma for this file node. Now, this texture will be in the correct color space, so when I render, you can see that only the rose leaves are correct while all the other textures are washed out. So in keeping with this manual workflow, I would need to add that attribute to all my incoming color images. I'll add Texture Input Gamma to these leaves here as well. At the bottom of the attribute editor, you can see exactly what Texture Input Gamma adds to the node here. This is by default already set to sRGB textures, like most images out there are, and it gets them ready for linear rendering. Now here's the cool part. If I accidentally leave the Texture Input Gamma on these files, and I turn on Enable Color Management in Preferences, when I render, I can see that it does not double gamma correct those nodes, and everything looks as it should. The leaves are just fine and in the same space as everything else. Now, we've been rendering directly in the VFB and viewing it with that sRGB curve icon enabled, but how about batch rendering? Now here, I'll just kick off a frame through batch render, and I can confirm that the saved PNG output is indeed embedded with the right color space to display properly on my screen. And what I see in my images folder and what I see in my corrected VFB window are indeed the same. So the moral of this story is to use Maya's color management as it is, and everything should be fine when using newer versions of Maya. Now for older versions of Maya, it's best to assign the texture input gamma to each color file in image that you're using for your textures. So in this clip, we've taken a quick view into what linear workflow means, and we can rest assured that using V-Ray in Maya 2016 and up, that it works just the way it should at default.